So the other day, a member of my Element group was saying that if Anthony Joshua struggles with Francis Ngannou, then that's basically a damning indictment on the heavyweight division, because we've already had Tyson Fury, who many people consider to be the best heavyweight in the world, struggle with Ngannou. If AJ was as well, then this would somehow prove that the heavyweight division is actually very, very weak right now, because how can a guy who's never had a boxing match before just go straight into the top level at boxing in the heavyweight division and start having success? That's absurd. He said you wouldn't expect Sean Strickland, for example, to go into the super middleweight division or whatever and have success against Canelo. You'd expect him to get completely blown out. And I agree with that. But my response to the guy was, heavyweight boxing is a different animal to the rest of boxing. Why? Because the skill level at heavyweight has never been as high as it is in the lower weight classes, generally. And that's not just true today, it's always been the case. And when you combine it being the least skilled with having oversized punching power and huge weight disparities and height disparities between different fighters, this is what leads to a disproportionately high number of upsets. You tend to get more upsets in the top 10 of the heavyweight division than you do in the top 10 of any other weight class, historically. I've mentioned this in many videos over the past few months. Muhammad Ali lost to a 7-fight novice in Leon Spinks. Yeah, he had an Olympic gold medal. Leon Spinks went on to have a very poor career. He was basically the Audley Harrison of his day. Ali lost to that guy when he was vastly experienced as a heavyweight champion. 7-fight novice. Would Canelo lose to a 7-fight novice? Would Terence Crawford lose to a 7-fight novice? You wouldn't expect so, but Ali did, because heavyweight boxing is a different animal. That's what makes it so compelling. Furthermore, Francis Ngannou is not the average MMA fighter. He has certain physical gifts that Sean Strickland, for example, doesn't have. Francis Ngannou is probably one of, perhaps even the strongest person in heavyweight boxing right now. And we're not just talking about strength on a weights bench, we're talking about functional strength required for fighting. Ngannou has got immense physical strength in the ring. You wouldn't expect Sean Strickland to have that type of strength advantage over most super middleweights, would you? So Ngannou is an outlier in that sense, that he's going into a sport where, okay, he doesn't have the experience and he doesn't have the skills of the other guys, but he's stronger than most of them. And he's at least coming from a combat sport where he's used to getting hit. But again, to reiterate, the main thing is, in heavyweight boxing, and this has always been the case, the gap between the top guys, the elite guys, and the guys lower down isn't as big at heavyweight as it is at, let's say, middleweight, welterweight, super middleweight. It's not as big now, never has been as big. That's why you get so many upsets at heavyweight. It's not like you don't get upsets in the low weight divisions, you do. You just don't get them as frequently. The heavyweights have got the oversized power and far less skill than the smaller guys. But you know, there's always this desire, it seems, to bash the heavyweight division. It's the strangest thing, but as long as I've been alive, it hasn't ceased. It's been non-stop bashing of the heavyweight division. It was bashed throughout the 90s. It's only now we look back and people say, oh yeah, it was a golden age of heavyweight boxing. You guys weren't saying that at the time. You weren't calling it a golden age. You were bashing the division. When George Foreman beat Michael Moorer, people were using that as evidence of how weak the division is. How can this fat 45-year-old man win a heavyweight title? This shows how terrible heavyweight boxing is right now. That's what they were saying. Here's my thing. As long as the heavyweight division is competitive and there's loads of good, exciting fights happening, there's nothing to complain about. Some people like order. Chaos upsets them. They somehow think that order means the division is in a healthy state. Well, not necessarily. They look at the Klitschko era and say, we had these brothers who were dominating the division, nobody could touch them. That's what heavyweight boxing is supposed to be. So you want to see a division where there's no competitive bouts? You think that that's what makes a strong division? Again, going back to the golden ages, the golden eras of heavyweight boxing, in the 1990s, there was loads of upsets. There was chaos. In the 1970s, upsets and chaos. Surprises. That's why we look back on those times as special. Normally, you only have a monolithic, dominant champion who reigns for years when the division is relatively weak. That's what you had during the Mike Tyson era. It was a relatively weak division that one guy who was more talented than the rest was able to dominate. Same with the Klitschko era. But when the division is deeper, you get loads of upsets happening, loads of competitive fights, loads of surprises, chaos. It's a matter of who can survive the chaos and be the last man standing. In the 90s, it turned out to be Lennox Lewis. He survived all the chaos. He was the last man standing at the end of it. Now, Anthony Joshua should beat Francis Ngannou quite comfortably, whether it's on points or whether he stops him. There shouldn't be any controversy or any doubt over the result. But Ngannou is a big, strong man, probably stronger than AJ is. Again, he has certain physical advantages that, let's say, Sean Strickland wouldn't have over Canelo. He certainly has power that is apparently outsized and outlandish. He's going to be outweighing AJ probably by, 20, 30 pounds or something? Sean Strickland wouldn't be outweighing Canelo Alvarez by 20, 30 pounds, would he? So when you factor all that in, yeah, I definitely give Francis Ngannou a better chance of beating Anthony Joshua than I would give Sean Strickland of beating Canelo Alvarez, for sure. AJ's not as skilled as Canelo Alvarez. And you could argue that, okay, well, Ngannou isn't as skilled as Sean Strickland. Touche. But I'll say the gap in skill between AJ and Ngannou isn't as big as the gap in skill between Canelo and Sean Strickland. Same goes for all the other heavyweights. Not just today, but back in the 90s too. Lennox Lewis was the last man standing in the 90s. Are you telling me his skill was anywhere near that of Pernell Whitaker? Not even close. You telling me that Lennox Lewis's skill was comparable to James Toney? Those super middleweights had skill levels way higher than any of the heavyweights in the 90s. Smaller guys are more skilled, generally. You do get some exceptions here and there, okay? You wouldn't say Antonio Margarito was necessarily more skilled than all the heavyweights, right? But if you're talking about the upper echelon fighters in the lower weight classes, they're generally far more skilled than heavyweights. And this makes the barrier of entry, for an MMA fighter trying to compete in one of these lower weight classes, it's more difficult. And they're going to be, for the most part, the same size as the boxers they're trying to go up against. Whereas at heavyweight, if you're a big titan like Francis Ngannou, you're going to be bigger than a lot of the guys you're trying to fight. And in fact, I have to say something about the press conference the other day. Eddie Hearn was talking about how big Anthony Joshua and Francis Ngannou are, and he kept calling them atoms. Surely he meant to call them titans. Atoms are tiny, Eddie. And he said it several times. Do you know what I mean? That's what made it funny. Because we can all, with a slip of the tongue, make a mistake. But he kept on calling them atoms. I was like, huh? Anyway, a behemoth like Francis Ngannou is going to have a physical size advantage and strength advantage and even power advantage over a lot of heavyweight boxers. People say the heavyweights of the 70s are more skilled than the heavyweights today. I agree, but the heavyweights of the 70s were much smaller. The heavyweights of the 70s were the size of Usyk. I mean, George Foreman was like, 220 pounds? Less for some of his fights, and a little bit more for others. That's what Prime Foreman was. He was small by today's standards. Back then, he was seen as a giant. So yeah, generally the heavyweights were more skilled in the 70s because they were smaller. But there are some modern giant heavyweights today who have just enough skill combined with their extra size to overcome smaller, more skilled opponents. A guy like Alexander Usyk, who is a 1970s sized heavyweight, is an outlier. Most guys who come up from cruiserweight are not going to have the kind of success that Alexander Usyk has had. They might be more skilled than the big men, but not skilled enough to compensate for their lack of size. I mean, you look at a guy like Joe Frazier. In his prime, he was just over 200 pounds. 2'5", 210. Do you really think that Joe Frazier could have beaten the Klitschko brothers, for example? I don't. Anyway, you get the point I'm making. I'll leave it there. Are you sick and tired of the mainstream mindset? Does the dogmatic conformity and pathological ignorance have you tearing your hair out in frustration? Then don't be alone. Come and join our brotherhood on Patreon. We stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. You'll gain access to my weekly topical podcast where we take more deep dives than Jacques Cousteau on an endless variety of subjects. There's also videos, interviews, live Q&As, as well as a vast back catalogue of previous episodes, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen via the Patreon app or download in high-quality MP3. Connect with myself and hundreds of other members in our Element chat group. There's no contract, no commitment, you can cancel at any time, and it's cheaper than a Mickey D's McMuffin. Just head to my Patreon page via the link below this video and select the tier called the Brotherhood of Reason. I'll see you over there.